years ago, if I told a founder that they could hire a finance director, marketing director, CTO, or general counsel without employing them full time, most people would have thought that that sounded totally ridiculous. Today is becoming one of the fastest growing trends that we are seeing in business. Fractional CFOs, fractional CMOs, chief marketing officers, fractional CTOs, fractional COOs, fractional legal counsel. They're appearing everywhere. And the interesting question isn't why these services exist. The interesting question, in fact, is why so many businesses are choosing them over traditional hires. Because I think this trend tells us something very important about how modern businesses are actually evolving. And if you're a founder trying to scale, it may completely change the way that you think about building your leadership team. So let's firstly talk about the traditional approach. Historically, growth followed a fairly predictable pattern. You started a business, you did everything yourself, then you hired employees as you went along. As the business grew, you maybe added managers, then senior managers, then eventually directors, and you filled out a lot of the departments as you went along. But the assumption was always the same. If you need expertise, you hire somebody. Simple, easy as that. The problem is that reality rarely works that neatly, doesn't it ever? Because there comes a point where businesses need senior expertise, but they don't necessarily need a full-time executive or can afford one, to be honest, or want to. And that's where things can start to become very, very expensive. Let's take legal as an example. Many businesses reach a stage where legal issues become increasingly frequent. They might be negotiating contracts, they might be hiring employees, they might be expanding internationally, protecting intellectual property, managing regulatory requirements, speaking to investors, acquiring businesses, but they're not necessarily generating enough legal work to justify a full-time in-house lawyer. The same thing happens with finance. The same thing can also happen with tech, with the growth of AI. And we see the same thing happen with marketing as well. The need exists, but the volume doesn't necessarily justify the salary, the risk, or the infrastructure. Historically, businesses had two choices. They hire somebody anyway and take the hit, or they go without. Today, there is a third option, and that's when we discuss the rise of access over ownership. I think one of the biggest shifts that's happening in business right now is a move away from ownership and towards access. Think about software, for example. Businesses no longer buy servers, they buy cloud access. Think about offices. Businesses are no longer buying buildings. They are using flexible workspaces or they're leasing premises. And even think about transport. People are increasingly subscribing to transport rather than buying their own car, for example. We're seeing exactly the same thing happen with business expertise. Businesses don't necessarily want to own every capability, they want access to the capability. And that's what fractional services provide. It's really flexible. They give access to senior expertise without the commitment, the overhead, and the risk involved with a full-time hire. So why are founders embracing fractional specialists? Well, there are several reasons that they do this. The first is cost. Let's be totally honest. A high quality CFO, CTO, or general counsel is really expensive, and rightly so. These are very senior professionals who can have a significant impact on business performance. The challenge is that many growing businesses only really need a fraction of their time. Perhaps they need 1 day a week. They might only need a few hours a month, to be honest, depending on the size of the business. Or perhaps they just need support around specific projects. Maybe they're implementing AI into their business. Hiring full-time often means paying for capacity that you don't actually need on a full-time basis, and fractional models solve that problem. The second reason is experience. One of the biggest advantages of fractional professionals is that they have often seen dozens of businesses. A full-time executive might have worked in 3 companies. A fractional specialist may have worked with 50. That actually creates a lot of perspective that a straightforward hire wouldn't. There's pattern recognition, there's experience, there's the ability to spot problems before they occur, and that can be incredibly valuable. So let's have a think about the hidden advantage that nobody talks about. I think the biggest benefit of fractional service providers is actually objectivity. Founders are emotionally invested in their businesses, employees are emotionally invested in their jobs. Fractional specialists kind of sit somewhere in between. They can provide you with honest, straightforward advice. They can challenge the assumptions you're making. They can identify risks in your business, and they can ask the difficult questions without becoming entangled in internal politics. That perspective can be incredibly powerful. So let's talk about where fractional legal counsel fits in, because I'm a lawyer. So let's talk specifically about my specialty, because this is where I think many businesses get stuck. Most founders don't need a law firm every single day, but equally, they often need more support than simply instructing a lawyer when something goes wrong. They want someone who understands the business, who knows what your wants, needs, desires are, what the risks are, understands the contracts involved in the business, understands your growth plans, your ambitions, and understands the people. That's where fractional legal support can become very attractive for a founder. Instead of repeatedly briefing different lawyers, and instead of starting from scratch every single time, you build a relationship with somebody who gets to know the business from the inside out. The legal support becomes much faster. It becomes more proactive. It becomes more commercial, more strategic, and often significantly more cost effective than building an in-house legal function. So what are the key risks that you need to watch out for when you're thinking about fractional support? That does not mean that every fractional provider is equal, far from it. One of the biggest mistakes businesses make is focusing purely on cost. The cheapest option is going to rarely be the best option. What matters is experience and what that person or that firm can bring to the table. Responsiveness matters, commercial understanding, industry knowledge, and the ability to integrate with your team. A good fractional specialist shouldn't feel like an external advisor. They should feel like an extension of your business, of your own team. And that is the real benchmark by which to measure a fractional specialist. So let's talk about what the future looks like. Personally, I think this trend is only going to accelerate with small and medium-sized businesses, because businesses are becoming much more flexible as we go through the time. Tech is making remote collaboration even easier, and founders are becoming increasingly sophisticated in how they're able to build their teams. The old model of employing every specialist full-time person simply just doesn't make sense for many businesses anymore, particularly during periods of uncertainty, which the market is in right now, and particularly during periods of growth, particularly when expertise can be accessed on demand. And I think that the businesses that embrace this shift intelligently will often outperform those that don't, because they will gain access to expertise that would previously have been far beyond their reach. That's just the way it is. If you're a founder, only needs expertise and where you're simply relying on yourself to fill the gap, because that's often where growth starts to stall. And if legal is one of those areas, we would be delighted to have a conversation about it, because this is exactly what we do. At Jamieson Law, we work with ambitious founders, we work with growing businesses across the UK and Ireland, providing commercially focused legal support that feels like an extension of your team. If you've enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments. Would you hire a fractional executive rather than a full-time one? Let us know.